Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through an example of a question on the production possibilities frontier. And we want to be attentive because essentially we are going to use the same process over and over and over again. So long as we can get the understandings down here and get a little practice, we can then just do the same thing on any of the questions that we see about the production possibilities frontier. There's only so many ways that the College Board can test your understanding of this concept. So here we have two production possibilities frontier. You have two people, and that's what you always have with production possibilities. You have either two people or two countries. You have a farmer here and you have a rancher. These lines represent what the farmer can produce, meat and potatoes, if it devotes all of its time to meat, or if it devotes all of its time to potatoes, or if it splits it. You'd be anywhere on this line. The rancher, it's shown here, the production possibilities frontier for him or her. If they devote all their time to meat, 32, devote all their time to potatoes, 48, or they can be at any combination in between. And now, what we need to do is answer some of these questions that I hope we're now familiar with. We have, what is or who has the absolute advantage in meat? Absolute advantage in potatoes, comparative advantage in meat, comparative advantage in potatoes. And then we'll get to these at a later point in time. What I would encourage all of you to do, anytime you see this presentation, a graph, translate that into a table, as I've done here. I have F standing for the farmer, R standing for the rancher, and then the quantities that they can produce if they devote all of their time, or to use our economics term, if they specialize in the production of these items. Now, in order to determine absolute advantage, all we need to do is figure out who uses up less inputs to produce that same output. Or we could say, given the same amount of time, which is perhaps our only input, who produces more output? As we look at this, this is pretty simple. With respect to meat, the farmer, they spend all their time, can only produce 8 ounces of meat, whereas the rancher can produce 32. So who has an absolute advantage in meat production? That would be our rancher. The way we would explain this is to say that the rancher can produce more meat than the farmer given the same resources. Or you could quantify it. You could say the rancher can produce 24 additional ounces given the same time and resources. Or you could say, from an input standpoint, a rancher produces an ounce of meat in a fourth the time as the farmer. Any of those would work. Now, who has the absolute advantage in potatoes? It must be the farmer, correct? That is wrong. If you look here, the farmer, if he spends all of his time making potatoes, can only make 24, whereas the rancher can make 48 ounces. Again, the rancher is more productive. Given the same time, given the same resources, they can produce more than the farmer. So, our rancher also has an absolute advantage in potato making. Important understanding, you can absolutely have an absolute advantage in both things. Okay? But now, what the heck is comparative advantage? Hopefully we know now that comparative advantage is who has the lower opportunity cost in the production of that good. And what we're trying to show here with the production possibilities frontier is that society and countries, they face trade-offs. You can either do this or you can do that. You cannot be in two places at once. So if you are making meat, you are giving up the opportunity to make potatoes. If you're making potatoes, you're giving up the opportunity to make meat. So let's look here and figure out how expensive, what it costs the farmer to make meat. It's going to be measured in how many potatoes they give up. So if they spend all their time, the farmer does, they can make 8 ounces of meat. And in that same time, they could be making 32 ounces of potatoes. So the cost of 1 ounce of meat is how many potatoes they could have been making in that same time, which would be 4. All we needed to do was take, and I'll just do this once because I'm short on space here, 32 over 8. So the cost of a single ounce of meat is 4 tons of potatoes. We could do the exact same thing now for the rancher. We want to see how expensive meat is. Meat is going to be how many potatoes you could have been making given the time that you were making meat. We can see 48 divided by 24 is going to be 2 potatoes. These are our opportunity costs for meat for our 2 individuals, our farmer and our rancher. Now we can see who's got a comparative advantage in meat production. It's who has a lower opportunity cost. We can see that the rancher should be making meat because the rancher has a lower opportunity cost. The rancher has a comparative advantage in meat production. Now let's look at potatoes. The cost of a potato is how many ounces of meat you have to give up. Well, the farmer can spend all of his time, and if he does, doing so making potatoes, he can make 32. In that same time, he could have been producing 8 ounces of meat. So how expensive is a single potato? Well, it would be 1/4 an ounce of meat. Real simple here, it's the reciprocal. So we have 4 ounces of potatoes have to be given up, and now it's 1/4 ounce of meat. We come down here for the rancher, and we do the exact same thing. We say, I can make 48 potatoes, but if I do, I give up the opportunity to make 24 ounces of meat. It's 24 divided by 48. It would be 1/2 an ounce of meat. So, who has the comparative advantage in potato production? It's who has a lower opportunity cost. I look up here and I see 1/4 of an ounce of meat and 1/2 an ounce of meat. It appears that the farmer, when they make potatoes, gives up less in terms of meat. Therefore, the farmer has a comparative advantage in potatoes. Important understanding. You cannot have a comparative advantage in both. It is impossible. So now a couple of new terms. F stands for the farmer. What should the farmer specialize in? Remember that this production possibilities frontier is to illustrate one of the core concepts of economics that people can gain from trade. That if you specialize in one thing and then trade for all others, you're actually going to be able to consume outside of what you yourself can produce. So what should F specialize in? F should specialize in what the farmer should specialize in, what they have a comparative advantage in. That would be potatoes. So the farmer is going to specialize in potatoes. Excuse my sloppy handwriting. And now, even though these people are probably in the same country, let's assume that they were in different countries. Now, what is the farmer going to export? What are they going to send to that other country? Well, they're going to send what they specialized in, the potatoes. And so they're going to export, and I'm just going to write P. Now, that means that they're getting no meat because they're specializing in potato production. So in order to get meat, they would have to import it. So they would be, and that is the farmer when I'm saying they, importing meat because they have a comparative disadvantage or they have a higher opportunity cost in meat production. We could come over here, do the same analysis for the rancher. The rancher should specialize in that which he has a comparative advantage in. The rancher has a comparative advantage in meat production. Therefore, he is going to export meat. And he is going to import potatoes. This is our template. We want to be able to do this with all of the questions we see on the production possibilities frontier. But I'm going to show you one more thing because the AP test, the College Board, wants to manipulate things and make it challenging for you. The way they can make it most challenging is to do this. They ask you, what are acceptable terms of trade? If the farmer and the rancher wanted to strike an agreement that was advantageous for both of them, what in the heck would they do? Well, here's how we're going to solve this, a 3-step process. The first thing we're going to do is identify who should produce what. We already did that. So if we come back here, we see the farmer should make potatoes and the rancher should specialize in meat. Step 1, already completed. Step 2 is to find the opportunity cost of the good that, of the good each country does not have a comparative advantage in, if they produce it themselves. In other words, find what they're producing first, and then find what they are not producing or shouldn't produce second if they're going to trade. And see how expensive that other good is if they produce it themselves. And obviously we're talking about opportunity cost. And then, when they give you some proposed trade agreement, compare the opportunity cost that you found in step 2 with the opportunity cost now that they're trading. Let's do this. So here we see our numbers again. We need to come back. I haven't filled in a couple of blanks. Remember, the farmer, the opportunity cost for meat is measured in potatoes. So the farmer has to give up 4 potatoes for every ounce of meat that they produce. The rancher, it's 2 potatoes for every ounce of meat they produce. And it's the reciprocal over here. 1/4 potatoes, excuse me, take that back. We're talking about the cost of a potato. Oops, excuse me. If we're talking about the cost of potatoes, it's always measured in meat. I hope you understood that. And we here have 1/2 an ounce of meat. So, now we have our opportunity cost. Now we can do step 2. Step 1, or excuse me, even before this, this is our terms of trade. This is what the question is asking. Is 3 ounces of potatoes for 1 ounce of meat acceptable to both farmer and rancher? Well, we established that the farmer was going to make potatoes. And they make potatoes because they have a comparative advantage in it. Step 2 was to figure out, well, if they're making potatoes, they could have been making meat. And if they make meat, how expensive is it? So for the farmer, an ounce of meat costs them 4 potatoes. So the opportunity cost, oh, excuse me, messed up again. So what happens when you do things live? An ounce of meat, because this is what they're trading for, or thinking about trading for, costs them 4 potatoes when they make it itself. So now all we need to do is look at the trade agreement. This is step 3. 3 ounces of potatoes need to be given up for 1 ounce of meat. They're going to be making those potatoes. And they're going to get 1 ounce of meat for 3 potatoes. That's the terms of trade. Whereas if they do it themselves, they have to give up 4 ounces of potatoes. So this is an acceptable term of trade, at least for the farmer. Now let's see, because this is a two-way street, what the rancher sees out of this. The rancher is going to produce the meat. That means that they're not going to be producing potatoes, but they can. And we want to look at the opportunity cost of producing potatoes for the rancher. We look up here, the rancher, we look at potatoes, it's 1/2 an ounce of meat. Okay? So, if I'm the rancher, I can't give up any more than 1/2 an ounce of meat for a single potato. Well, I see over here that I would get 3 potatoes for a single ounce of meat. So, what's the opportunity cost of a single ounce of potatoes in this trade agreement? The way we figure this out is we just take the 1 over 3. It is 1/3 an ounce of meat. Because I'm getting 3 potatoes for 1 ounce of meat, so a single potato is costing me 1/3 an ounce of meat. And all I need to do is make sure that 1/3 an ounce of meat is less than me doing it myself. 1/2 an ounce of meat, 1/3 is smaller than 1/2. This is an acceptable term of trade. And it gets no more complicated than this. So I hope you understood this and enjoyed the video.